this border and these security arrangements will go hand in hand with the formal act of recognition and end of conflict. That's the big picture. And since you can't get there in a bilateral negotiation, we're going to put it forward and let you argue over it. But that's what we have learned from this process, that you need a picture of where this ends so that when you eventually face your publics, you can say, yeah, we had to give something up. It's really painful. As I said, for the Palestinians, it's going to be to say most of the refugees will get generous compensation, but they will not be going back to their prior homes or anywhere close to it. And that's a hard message. That's why they don't talk about it. It's really hard. But the only way you can say that is, but look what we get. We get a state with citizenship, capital in Jerusalem, and West Bank Gaza, which is what we have said for 20 years we will be satisfied with. And then you switch it to the Israeli side and you say, we got the end of the conflict. We will get recognition from every Arab state. The international community will get off our back over being an apartheid-like state. But we do have to give up the territory, including East Jerusalem. But we don't have to take a flood of refugees back. Unless you can present that package, each of the details just feels like exquisite torture. And I think that is conceptually something that if we're going to play the mediator role, we have to get it into our mind that we have to be the bad guy on this and put that out there sometime. And maybe it's still worth doing as a way of kind of memorializing what we've learned from all of this. But I agree that if you bring all the technicians in prematurely before you have that, it doesn't lead anywhere. I think we spent too much time on security and got too little for it, because that's the technical kind of thing that everybody can work on. What we should have been working on is a map, not percentages. This is my other lesson, is whoever introduced the idea of talking about territory in terms of what percentage of the territory that Israel now occupies will be retained or returned, without saying, and this is what it will look like on the map, was doing people a disservice. At the end of the day, neither side will ever agree until they see what it looks like on a map. So let's get on with it. I mean, people in the real world, think tanks and so forth, do this all the time. You can go on multiple programs, push a button, say 3% land swaps might look like this. It could look like this. It could, and they look quite different. You can have Ariel in or not. Makes a big difference if you're a Palestinian, but the percentage is like 0.5%. So there are aspects of the U.S. mediator role that trouble me a bit from this last round. I think the Secretary of State showed enormous energy. That's great. We, in our previous book, blamed the Clinton administration for overusing the president. He was on the phone, available any time. He met with Arafat endlessly. And I think we felt that presidential authority is such that it should be used sparingly, but then on the big issues. I think on this round, unlike perhaps the first part of the Obama administration, the president was too absent. Now, I don't know the inside story. This is a very close to the chest Secretary of State, so we don't have an awful lot of ideas about what the crucial moments were and how they were played out. But I do think that there are moments when the president's authority has to be brought to the fore. And there's something about the detachment of Obama from this recent round, as if, I know it's not going to work, but the Secretary of State wants to try, good luck to him. That message gets across to people, and it sends the signal that this isn't really going to come to a make or break conclusion. I'm sure I had something else. Oh, what was it? I had something else to say, but I will get another round, right?
Yes,
I don't want to go on too long.
Again. No, this is a great start, and actually, you know, you raised at the outset the sort of the structural challenges.
Can I say one more?
Yes.
It came to my mind. Okay. Ilan says in his paper that the American team always understood the Israeli side better. We coordinated with them, we spent time with them. From the Palestinian standpoint, what that looked like is everything had already been agreed upon by the time it was presented to them. I think that's particularly unfortunate when you're presenting it to the weaker party, and way weaker party. They feel like they're up against a superpower and then the regional superpower, and it's all been cooked in advance. And one of the points we made in the Peace Puzzle book is that Sometimes the American the backup team that sort of supports all this process, does the hard work, doesn't have diversity built into it, in the sense that there aren't people who understand the Palestinian side terribly well. We always have plenty of people in recent years who have a lot of knowledge about the Israeli side. And I don't think that that lesson got reflected in the structure of that echelon. Now, you tell me that I'm wrong if I am, but it seemed to me, just looking at who was there, is that you didn't have a problem with people who knew a lot about Israel, but you didn't have the comparable depth on the Palestinian side. And I think there's a case to be made for, if you're going to be deeply engaged, you should be more equitably equipped to deal with both sides, and the extreme lengths to which we go now to coordinate everything with Israel first and then kind of present it to the Palestinians. It's bound to create a negative reaction, and it adds to the difficulty of getting the Palestinians to engage, and to engage in a constructive way.
Thank you. And Ilan, I will let you have a chance to respond to that later, but if I can move
Sure.
Tammy, to you, and we've raised these structural issues about the conflict, and in some ways started to get into structural issues of how we have run this process with the U.S. to date. So given that, would love to hear your thoughts on how fixable some of those are, what's the way forward?
Okay, I will do that. I do want to address Bill's last point, though, and of course, Ilan should give his perspective from the inside, but I'll say from the outside. But as somebody who served in the first term of the Obama administration before this effort came into being, what I saw was a very strong, relative to previous effort to engage with Palestinian politics, whether it's Michael Ratney, the Congen, and a far more functional dynamic between Congen Jerusalem and Embassy Tel Aviv than I think we've seen in previous rounds. To me, that was a big improvement. The way the Consul General was kind of factored in and consulted and part of the process. Having Hadi Amr on the peace team, I would say as well, and some of the folks who were on the NFC staff have their own experience in Jerusalem and with Palestinian politics. So while I don't think that necessarily completely corrects for the structural bias that exists where the United States has a sort of more instinctive understanding and sympathy for the democratic politics of a parliamentary system in Israel than it does for the opaque maneuvering of Fatah-driven politics in the West Bank. I think that structural inequity is still there, but I think personality-wise, at least there was an effort to correct for it, in my view. I was glad that Bill raised the issue about personalities of the leaders, because of course, it's true that negotiations aren't done on the basis of trust, and also that trust or lack of trust is not a matter of chemistry. It's something that can emerge in the course of a negotiation. But reading the report, this section of the report, Ilan, it put me in mind of this exchange in Thor: The Dark World, where if any of you know these Marvel movies, Loki, the brother of Thor, is the bad guy in the first Thor movie, and then in the second movie they team up. And at one point, Thor says to his brother, "I wish I could trust you." And Loki says, "Trust my rage." In other words, you don't have to trust the other guy, the other leader. You do have to trust that you understand what his motives are and what his objectives are. And I'm going to come back to this in a minute, because I think it's an important point about what the United States needs to do next time before it launches a new negotiating process. But, I wanted to sort of project ahead a little bit, because I think in many ways Ilan's report release coincides with this clarifying moment in Israeli politics and in the U.S.-Israel relationship on the peace process, and so it's worth kind of thinking about where we are right now and what that means. And I think that a number of us have been arguing for some time that the Oslo model, that is the incremental model, Bill, but also the model of a direct bilateral negotiation mediated by the United States, that model was exhausted. And if we had any doubt about whether it had viability left, I think this last round demonstrated it is truly exhausted. And that was evident, I think, even before Netanyahu pronounced its death. But he did that very decisively in his comments the day before the Israeli elections, when he said, there is no viability to a negotiated two-state solution right now. In the current set of circumstances, and he laid out his conditions, what needs to change, it's not viable. Okay, so if one of the parties says this model is no longer viable, then it's no longer viable. And what does that mean? I think it's incumbent on Israel, the United States, and the Palestinians to sort of think in some particular directions. For the Israelis, I think, for the last 6 years, Netanyahu at least formally acquiesced to the goal of a two-state solution and to the mechanism of this bilateral negotiation. If he's now set that aside, and I think he has, what's the alternative that Israel is proposing to manage its relationship with the Palestinians? And stasis is not an alternative. I think we've seen, and Ilan laid this out very well in the report, the consequences of a vacuum are dangerous, and we've already seen that over the last year. So Israel's got to come up with something, particularly if it wants American support, if it wants to avoid some of the scenarios that Ilan mentioned that have been tossed around in terms of American unilateralism, if you will, then the Israelis need to have a policy proposal. And I would hope that they're working on that expeditiously. And I think that the United States also needs to think about what sort of non-negotiated mechanism, what sort of unilateral Israeli mechanism, if that's what they propose, the U.S. would see as constructive, as advancing or preserving a two-state solution, and what kinds of unilateralism it might see as unconstructive, retarding, or contradicting the possibility of a two-state solution. For the United States, too, though, there's been this premise that the U.S. is the essential mediator because it is the one that is close to Israel, that can bring Israel along. If you're on the Arab side,